The New Year Honours 1993 were appointments by most of the 16 Commonwealth realms of Queen Elizabeth II to various orders and honours to reward and highlight good works by citizens of those countries, and honorary ones to citizens of other countries. They were announced on the 30th of December 1992 to celebrate the year past and mark the beginning of 1993. Recipients of honours are listed here as they were styled before the new honours. United Kingdom, Life Peer, Baroness the Right Honourable Shirley Vivian Teresa Britton Williams, founder member and former president of the Social Democrat Party. Privy Councillor Baroness Emily May Blatch, C.B.E. Minister of State, Department for Education. For political service, Sir Percy Craddock, CMG, formerly Foreign Policy Advisor to the Prime Minister. Sir Peter Frank Hannibal Emery, MP Member of Parliament for Honiton. For political service, Sir Peter Maudsley Horden, MP, DL Member of Parliament for Horsham. For political service, Sir John Daniel Wheeler, D.L., MP Member of Parliament for Westminster North. For political service, Knight Bachelor Malcolm Henry Arnold, C.B.E. Composer, Robert George Alexander Balchan, Chairman, Grant Maintained Schools Foundation, Francis Christopher Buchan Bland, Chairman, Hammersmith and Queen Charlotte's Hospitals Special Health Authority. John Freeman Chatfield, C.B.E. lately Chairman, Executive Council, Association of County Councils. Robert Cyril Clark, Chairman, United Biscuits plc, for services to the food industry. Harry R. E. Simon Ginogly, C.B.E. for charitable services. David Paradine Frost, O.B.E. broadcaster and journalist. Professor Henry Harris, for contribution to medical research. Anthony Philip Hopkins, C.B.E. actor. Eric Waldo Benjamin Howells, C.B.E. for political and public service. Professor David Hull, Professor of Child Health, University Hospital Nottingham. Geoffrey David Incan, O.B.E. Chairman, Cardiff Bay Development Corporation. Chairman, Land Authority for Wales. For public service in Wales. John Raymond Johnston, C.B.E. Chairman, Forestry Commission. For public service in Scotland. John Chippendale Lindley Keswick, Chairman, Ambrose Bank Limited. For services to banking. Michael Anthony Latham, formerly Member of Parliament for Rutland and Melton. For political service, Christopher Lewington, Chairman and Chief Executive, T Group plc. For services to the engineering industry, Alistair John McKechnie. For political service, Peter Mansfield, F.R.S. Professor of Physics, Magnetic Resonance Centre, University of Nottingham. Roger Dennis Moate, MP, Member of Parliament for Faversham. For political service, Geoffrey John Mulcahy, Chairman and Chief Executive, Kingfisher plc. For services to the retail industry, Colonel Stuart Richard Newman, C.B.E. TD. For political service, Charles Wilfred Newton, C.B.E. Chairman of London Transport and of London Underground Limited. Duncan Kirkbride Nichol, C.B.E. Chief Executive, National Health Service Management Executive. Paul Douglas Nicholson, for services to industry and to the public in North East England. Professor David Keith Peters, Regius Professor of Physics, University of Cambridge. Professor John Cyril Smith, C.B.E. for services to academic law. John Allen Thomas, Head of the Defence Export Services Organisation, Ministry of Defence. His Honour Judge Lawrence John Verney, TD, DL, the Recorder of London. William Whitfield, C.B.E. Senior Partner, Whitfield and Partners. For services to architecture, Alfred William Wigan, TD, MP, Member of Parliament for Weston-super-Mare. For political service, William Purvis, C.B.E.D. S.O. J.P. for public and commercial services in Hong Kong. Order of the Bath. Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath General Sir David Ramsbotham, K.C.B.C. B.E.A. D.C. Gen. Late the Royal Green Jackets, Honorary Colonel Cambridge University Officers Training Corps. Air Chief Marshal Sir Michael Graydon, K.C.B.C. B.E.A. D.C. Royal Air Force. Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath Vice Admiral Geoffrey William Roger Biggs, Vice Admiral Michael Henry Gordon Laird, C.B.E. Air Marshal John Frederick Willis, C.B.C. B.E. Royal Air Force. Thomas Stuart Legge, C.B.Q.C. Permanent Secretary, Lord Chancellor's Department. Companion of the Order of the Bath, Military Division Rear Admiral Colin Herbert Dickinson Cook Priest. Surgeon Rear Admiral David Askey Lamyman, L.V.O.Q. HS Rear Admiral John Geoffrey Robone Mason. Major General Richard Edward Barron, late the Queen's Royal Irish Hussars. Major General William Andrew Evans, late 5th Royal Inniskilling Dragoon Guards. The Reverend James Harkness, O.B.E.Q. H.C. Royal Army Chaplains' Department. Major General James Frederick Junior Johnston, C.B.E. late Corps of Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers. Major General John Donald MacDonald, C.B.E. late Royal Corps of Transport. Air Vice Marshal David Rowthorne French, M.B.E. Royal Air Force. Air Vice Marshal Peter John Harding, C.B.E.A. F.C. Royal Air Force. The Venerable Brian Humphrey Lucas, Q.H.C. Royal Air Force. Civil Division Trevor Buckley, lately Grade 3, Ministry of Defence. Eric Gaines, Grade 2, Department of Health. Stephen Rex Davey, Grade 3, Cabinet Office. Christopher David Dakin, Government Actuary. Ian Malcolm Dunbar, Grade 3, Home Office. Hugh Prideaux Evans, Grade 2, HM Treasury. David Charles Thomas Eves, Grade 2, Health and Safety Executive, Department of Employment. John Hepworth Helroyd, 1st Civil Service Commissioner, Office of Public Service and Science. Donald William Lyman, Clerk Assistant, House of Commons. Roger Davis Munro, lately Chief Master, Chancery Division, Lord Chancellor's Department. John Lachlan Semple, Permanent Secretary, Department of Finance and Personnel, Northern Ireland Civil Service. Robbo John Alfred Sharp, Grade 3, Department of the Environment. Jeremy Bernard Sir, lately Grade 3, Department of Employment. Ewan Ross Sutherland, Parliamentary Council. Alan Ronald Titchener, Grade 3, Department of Trade and Industry. William Alistair Patterson Weatherston, Grade 3, Scottish Office. Irving Yass, Grade 3, Department of Transport. Order of St. Michael and St. George. Knight Grand Cross of the Order of St. Michael and St. George C.U. and Alistair John Ferguson, CVOK, CMG, HM Ambassador, Paris. Knight Commander of the Order of St. Michael and St. George the Right Honourable Cranley Gordon Douglas Onslow, MP, Member of Parliament for Woking. For political service. John Anthony Argia, Director, Government Communications Headquarters. Nigel Hugh Robert Allen Broomfield, C.M.G., HM Ambassador Designate, on. Michael John Newington, C.M.G., lately HM Ambassador, Brasilia. Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George Roger Campbell Beetham, L.V.O. HM Ambassador, Dhaka. David Allen Burns, Head of the British Mission to Cambodia, Phnom Penh. Charles John Carey, lately a member of the European Court of Auditors, Brussels. Ian Pender-Chalmers, O.B.E. Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Arthur Leicester Scott Coldman, H.M. Ambassador, Havana. Richard Nigel Dales, British High Commissioner, Harare. John Robert de Fontblanc, Councillor, Office of the United Kingdom, Permanent Representative to the European Commission, Brussels. Martin Roger Eaton, Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Alan Everard Montgomery, HM Ambassador, Manila. Jeffrey David George Merrill, OBE Minister, Council at HM Embassy, Moscow. The Honourable Michael Aidan Pakenham, HM Ambassador, Luxembourg. Michael John Priestley, lately Senior Advisor, United Nations Development Programme, New York. Adrian John Sindel, British High Commissioner, Brunei. Royal Victorian Order Knight Commander of the Royal Victorian Order Robin Catford, C.B.E. Dr. Anthony Michael Dawson. Sir Ashley Charles Gibbs Ponsonby, B.T. M.C. The Right Honourable George Kenneth Hodgson, Baron Younger of Prestwick, T.D.D.L., Commander of the Royal Victorian Order, Ino Kefoti Ufalitau. Kenneth Lionel Richardson, Q.S.O. Major Thomas Edward St. Auburn. The Right Honourable John Julius, Viscount Norwich. Jocelyn Edward Greville Stevens. Robin Dennis Gill. Sir Anthony Rupert J. Edward Uri Mears F. Lieutenant of the Royal Victorian Order Jennifer, Mrs. Adams. William Gavin Buchanan. Richard Saxon French, M.V.O.R. V.M. Commander David Newing, Royal Navy. Geoffrey Nolan. The Lady Angela Mary Rose Oswald. Anthony Patrick Smith. Jane Armine, Mrs. Stevens. Philip Bonham Carter, M.V.O. Katrine Patricia, Mrs. Clay. Peter Leslie Edwards, M.V.O. Neville Labovich, M.B.E. Sarah. The Honourable Lady Riddle. Member of the Royal Victorian Order Alan Beatty Armstrong. Chief Inspector John Derek Askew, Metropolitan Police. Eric James Baker. Inspector Roger Franklin Barrell, Metropolitan Police. Laura Amelia, Mrs. Callender, M.B.E. Thomas Leonard Corby. Claire, Mrs. Good. Diana, Mrs. Graham. Miss Pamela Ann Lewis. John Patrick Manley. Henrietta Francis, Mrs. Ryan. Jonathan Spencer. Bar to the Royal Victorian Medal Thomas Galbraith, R.V.M. Royal Victorian Medal Local Acting Chief Marine Engineering Mechanic David Bosworth, Royal Navy. Sergeant Gary Philip Robert Cole, Eng. Tech. A. Royal Air Force. William Edward Marsden Cotton. Miss Evelyn Mary Dagley. Police Constable Tony Basil George, Metropolitan Police. Terence Richard Hampstead. Terence John Alfred Hicks. Francis Kirkpatrick. Michael Robert Pusey. James Regan. William Johnston Robb. Sergeant David Leslie Spouge, Eng. Tech. Av. Royal Air Force. Ronald George Well-Beloved, M.B.E. Mervyn Seth Wycherley. Radio Supervisor William John Young, Royal Navy. Alan James Ligo. Brian John Herring. Companion of Honour Sir Victor Sworden Pritchett, C.B.E. Writer. Order of the British Empire Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire Catherine Anne, Mrs. Cookson, O.B.E. Novelist. For charitable services. The Honourable Mary Drummond Corser, National Chairman, Women's Royal Voluntary Service. Mary Allison, Mrs. Glenn Haig, C.B.E. for services to sport. Miss Anne Laura McLaren, Research Fellow, King's College, Cambridge. For services to science. Annette Mrs. Penhaligon, for political and public service. Miss Margaret Berenice Price, C.B.E. Opera Singer. Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire Lieutenant General the Honourable Thomas Patrick John Boyd Carpenter, M.B.E. Late Scots Guards. The Right Honourable Terence Langley Higgins, M.P. Member of Parliament for Worthing. For political service. Michael Ramsey Matthews, C.M.G. Head of European Commission Monitor Mission, Zagreb, New Zealand. Knight Bachelor the Honourable John Francis Jeffreys, lately a Judge of the High Court. Gordon Charles Mason OBE-JP, for services to local government. Order of St. Michael and St. George, Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George, Professor Margaret Clark, for services to education. The Right Honourable David Spence Thompson MC.Ed, for public services. Order of the British Empire, Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire Civil Division Miss Rubina Ann Ballon CBE, for services to the community. Mrs. Helen June Patricia Everson OBE, for services to theatre, television and the community. Thea Dale, Lady Muldoon QSO, for services to the community. Commander of the Order of the British Empire Civil Division Mrs. Mary Valeria Lyson JP, for services to country women's institutes. John Edward Keeney QSO JP, for services to local body and community affairs. Emeritus Professor Nancy Joan Kinross, for services to nursing and nursing education. Dr. Dorothy Field Usher Potter, for services to ophthalmology. Mrs. Aroha Hoey Piro Riri Crofts, for services to the Maori people and the community. Mrs. Esme Irene Tombleson QSO, for services to multiple sclerosis and the community. Edward James Tonks, for services to rugby. Noel Henry Yarrow JP, for services to the baking industry, export and the community. John Anderson Jameson OBE, Commissioner of Police, New Zealand Police, Military Division Commodore Kevin Frederick Wilson LVO, Royal New Zealand Navy. Officer of the Order of the British Empire Civil Division Brian Shields Armstrong QFSM, for services to the New Zealand Fire Service. Mrs. Muriel Dorothy Butler, for services to children's literature. Michael Armstrong Collins JP, lately Director General, Department of Scientific and Industrial Research. Peter David Cox, for services to the travel and tourist industries. Dr. Keith Douglas Drayton, for services to medicine and the community. Mrs. Vivian Mary Duncan, for public services. Mrs. Anne Jocelyn Gluckman JP, for services to education and the community. Miss Mary Patricia Hanrahan, for services to education. Harold Ashworth Holmes MBE JP, for services to the community. Mrs. Meredith Jane Hunter, for services to the viticultural industry. Miss Joanne Robin Morris, for public services. Dr. Claudia Josepha Orange, for services to historical research. Mrs. Wendy Ross, for services to the community. Horace Noel Sayashia JP, for services to local government and sport. John Carl Sexton, for services to the disabled. Dr. Warwick Main-Smeaton, for services to sport medicine. Douglas Alexander Smith, for services to business management. Mrs. Nadu Tolmash, for services to the law. Military Division Captain David Ninian Wood, Royal New Zealand Navy. Colonel David John Grant, Colonel's List, New Zealand Army. Member of the Order of the British Empire Civil Division Miss Erin Margaret Baker, for services as a triathlete. Miss Philippa June Baker, for services to rowing. Mrs. Margaret Orpha Cleland JP, for services to the community. Mrs. Rona Davis, for services as a speech and drama teacher. Reginald James Denny JP, for services to local government. Mrs. Carolyn Drysdale, for services to manufacturing and export. John Albert Forville, for services to Toastmasters International. Henry Neville Haythorne, for services to ballet. Charles Christensen Hood-Bem, lately General Manager, Waikaria Prison, Department of Justice. Ian Alexander Hope, for services to the community. Miss Barbara Ann Kendall, for services to board sailing. Angus Macaulay, for services to piping. Thomas Wilford Mackay, for services to local government and the community. Roy Alexander McLennan, for services to local body and community affairs. John Edwin Jeremiah Marsh JP, for services to the Maori people and the community. Miss Lorraine Mary Moller, for services to athletics. John Lawrence Murray, for services to farming and the community. Miss Jennifer Frances Newstead, for services to sport. Mrs. Betty Nigro, for services to art. John William Rose, for services to the community. Mrs. Violet Shaper, for services to the blind. Dr. William Joseph Smith, for services to leprosy control and the community. Miss Lillian Valder, for services to the community. Mrs. Margaret Alcier Yelverton, for services to the hairdressing industry. Military Division Lieutenant Commander Susan Jane Taylor, Royal New Zealand Navy. Captain and Quartermaster William John Lillycrap, New Zealand Special Air Service. Squadron Leader Michael Philip Puller, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Queen's Service Order. Companion of the Queen's Service Order for Community Service Miss Annette Marie Green. Peter Milius Harcourt. Mrs. Valerie Gladys Newman. Major Thelma Florence Smith. Miss Joan Therese Timpany. Companion of the Queen's Service Order for Public Services Mrs. Maureen Parker Howe. Professor Timothy Samuel Curry II. Dr. Susan Mary Lokine. Brian Peter McDonnell. Charles Ernest Pointer J.P. Wilson Ernest Still. Mrs. Joan Eileen Williamson J.P. Queen's Service Medal. Queen's Service Medal for Community Service Mrs. Catherine Heather Allen J.P. Mrs. Ivy Francis Ball J.P. Mrs. Dorothy May Billington. Charles Harry Raymond Chester. Raymond Henry Churchill J.P. Edward John Churchhouse. Mrs. Ruth Shirley Clark. Leslie William Kaufman. Mrs. Judith Cossey. Peter Leonard Diamond J.P. Bevan Thomas Dunlop. Ranji Wilcox Ford. Mrs. Lorna Elizabeth Arlo Galbraith. Jack G. J.P. Mrs. Jana Lynn Orgin. Michael Kenneth Gray. Mrs. Agnes Mary Hall. Mrs. Irene Mary Hawkins. Charles Murray Hercus. Gerald Norman James. Mrs. Judith Ann Keeney. Mrs. Margaret Joy Llewellyn Lewis Benworth. Hector Cunningham Lowe. Mrs. Frances Jill McIver. Frederick Charles Munting. Mrs. Alison Doreen Nicol. Mrs. Evelyn Priscilla Ogilvie. Arthur Gordon Parry J.P. Murray John Patterson. Miss Molly Elizabeth Smith. Mrs. Connie Stevens. Mrs. Edith Ann Stubbersfield J.P. Mrs. Edith Clifton Walkley. Mrs. Huia Annie Welsh. Queen's Service Medal for Public Services Thomas William Robert Abbott J.P. Richard Samuel Ansters J.P. Mrs. Mary Burke, Office Manager, Parliamentary Council Office. Alan Walter Brewster J.P. Bruce Neville Broderson. The Venerable Gordon Alexander Butt. Ivan James Dickinson. Daniel Patrick Foohey J.P. Mrs. Marata Fuimar Ono. The Reverend Father Francis Patrick Garty. James Browning Hay J.P. Mrs. Vianne Hepburn. Mrs. Peter Leming. Mrs. Helen Marie Jarvie. Harry Alfred Johansson J.P. Mrs. Ermi Jones. Mrs. Te'eo Muhurangi Temarka Jones J.P. Thomas Andrew Kincaid. Peter Alexley. Mrs. Valerie Louise Lundy. Miss Jessie Edith Mahadi. Mrs. Lorna Betsy Macmillan. Jack Brayshaw Midgley MMJP. Miss Judith Christine Owen. Miss Audrey Patricia Sim. Miss Iolanthe Small. Ropata Wahawaha Sterling. Douglas James Truman. Mrs. Mary Rose Wilson. Mrs. Hilary Wooding J.P. Murray Ross Gallagher, Detective, New Zealand Police. Gordon Grantham, Sergeant, New Zealand Police. Queen's Fire Service Medal John Braidwood, Chief Fire Officer Alexandra Volunteer Fire Brigade, New Zealand Fire Service. Kenneth Maclay Watkins, Chief Fire Officer Tapuke Volunteer Fire Brigade, New Zealand Fire Service. Hugh Carl Baker JP, Senior Station Officer Haumawana Volunteer Fire Brigade, New Zealand Fire Service. British Empire Medal Military Division Chief Petty Officer Dennis Keane, Royal New Zealand Naval Volunteer Reserve. Flight Sergeant John Paul Fleming, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Queen's Police Medal Graham George Cleland, Sergeant, New Zealand Police. Air Force Cross-Wing Commander Brian Carruthers, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Queen's Commendation for Valuable Service in the Air Flight Lieutenant Ian Aubrey Tuke, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Cook Islands. Order of the British Empire Member of the Order of the British Empire Civil Division Mrs. Pauline Margaret Rakera George Karika, for services to the House of Varikis and the community. British Empire Medal Civil Division Ion Kaitara Toto, for services to pearl farming.